Hi guys, we're talking about agriculture today, and we're starting off with where agriculture originated. So, we've talked about with our movie so far, Guns, Germs, and Steel, the invention of agriculture. So prior to agriculture, all humans probably obtained needed food through hunting and gathering. And we can't know the origins of agriculture with certainty, because we know that it began before recorded or written down history. Agriculture itself is the deliberate modification of the earth's surface through the cultivation of plants and rearing of animals to obtain sustenance or economic gain. So it's deliberately changing earth's surface by planting food, generally grains, cereal grains, and rearing or domesticating animals to obtain sustenance or economic gain. So this time period is called the agricultural revolution. This is when this is when plants were first domesticated, and animals were no longer when plants and animals were domesticated, and people no longer relied entirely on hunting and gathering. So this is the agricultural revolution. Agriculture originated in multiple hearths around the world. So crop hearths in Southwest Asia, the crops that they grew were barley, wheat, lentil, and olives. And in East Asia, the crops were rice and millet. In Sub-Saharan Africa, the early crops were sorghum, yams, millet, and rice. And in Latin America, the early crops were beans, cotton, potato, and then most importantly, maize, which we today know as corn. So if you take a look at this map, you can see the hearths of these crops, and this map is also on page 348 in your book if you need to refer to it. You can see the hearths of these early crops. So these are our hearths in blue, the primary hearths, and then the purple are the secondary hearths, so where things move to, and then the red lines are your dispersal routes. And you can see the red dates are where things started, and then the kind of aqua dates are where things move to, and then the purple dates are where things went from there. So that tells you where things started and then where they went beyond. And then, the red words are the first crops, the aqua dates, the aqua words are, it's really early. It's not really early, it's 8, but the aqua words are the less new plants, and then the purple words are the newer plants. And then the gray words, we're not quite sure when those came from. That was really confusing. I hope you understood. Okay, so agriculture originated in multiple hearths around the world. Animal hearths in Southwest Asia, the earliest domesticated animals were cattle, goats, pigs, sheep, and dogs. And in Central Asia, the earliest domesticated animals were horses. So there are two types of agriculture, subsistence and commercial agriculture. And subsistence or agriculture is food that is raised primarily for the consumption of that farmer's family. And this is generally practiced in developing countries. So this is food that you subsist on. This is food that your family needs to survive. In contrast, commercial agriculture is produced primarily for the sale off of the farm. And this is generally done in developed countries. And features that distinguish subsistence and commercial agriculture are that there's a lower percentage of farmers in the labor force. In commercial agriculture, it's highly mechanized, and there's a larger farm size. So commercial agriculture has the ability to hire less people because there are more machines, and they also can have a larger farm size because the machines can do more work with a lower labor force. So this is the percent of the labor force engaged in agriculture. And this is on page 350 in your book if you need it. And this is the farmland per tractor. And so you can see the difference between, in picture A, people who are doing subsistence farming, and picture B, people who are doing commercial farming, and the difference in mechanization. Okay, so why do people consume different foods? So let's look at diet. Dietary energy consumption is the amount of food that an individual consumes. And consumption of food varies around the world, both in the total amount and the source of nutrients, for two reasons. One is the level of development, and the second are the physical conditions in that place. So if we look at this map, it shows the leading food energy source. So we can see in a significant portion of the world, the leading food energy source is wheat. And then the next food energy source is probably rice, then maize or corn. And this map is on page 352 in your book if you need it. So developed and developing regions typically differ most in their primary sources of protein consumed. In developed countries, the leading source of protein is a meat product, for example, beef, pork, or poultry. And in developing countries, the leading source of protein is a cereal grain. So if we take a look at this map, the developed countries have a meat as their leading protein source, so those are in purple. And then the countries or the nations that have, the states that have dark orange, at least 50% cereals as their protein source. And then those that have like that yellow color, cereals at least 25% as their protein source. And then green, so we see up here, my mouse isn't working. And then here, those have other. So what do you think that other is? Think about those countries. What do you think that other is for their protein source? I bet you know. Smarties. I feel like Dora. What do you think? That's right. Okay, sorry. Okay, percent protein from meat. So look at all those meat eaters. Okay. Hunger, or nutrition and hunger. Undernourishment is dietary energy consumption that is continuously below the minimum requirement for maintaining a healthy life and carrying out light physical activity. So the UN estimates that 850 million people in the world are undernourished. 99% of those are located in developing countries. And worldwide, the total number of undernourished people has not changed much in several decades. So if we look at that, the greatest percentage of undernourished people are in India with 26.4%, and then we go to other sub-Saharan African countries at 21.8%, then to China at 15.2%, and then to other 5.8%, then Latin America 5.5%, Pakistan, Bangladesh, other Southeast Asia, then Pakistan, then Bangladesh, and so on and so forth. Okay, so this shows us our percent undernourished, and this is on page 355 if you need it. So you can definitely see, if my mouse were working, so India and then sub-Saharan Africa. So this shows us in a line graph. So South Asia, which is going to be India, then sub-Saharan Africa, East Asia. Okay, geographer Derwent Whittlesey. Don't geographers have amazing names? Derwent Whittlesey identified 11 main agricultural regions, plus an area where agriculture was non-existent. And 5 of these are present in developing countries. So we have pastoral nomadism, shifting cultivation, intensive subsistence, which is wet rice dominant, intensive subsistence, which is crops other than rice dominant, plantation. You guys might want to pause it here because there's a lot of writing. And then we have 6 present in developed countries. Mixed crop and livestock, dairying, grain, ranching, Mediterranean, and commercial gardening. So you can see there's a huge difference between those present in developing countries and developed countries. Okay, and so this map shows us, and this map is on pages 356 and 357. And this map, these 2 maps are going to be really important for a project that we're going to do on Friday. These maps are going to show you how the climate region that people live in really affects what type of farming they are able to do. So, what type of agriculture goes on in developing regions? Well, in pastoral nomadism is a form of subsistence agriculture. So remember, this is agriculture that people do in order to keep their families specifically alive, not to sell to somebody else. So subsistence agriculture, this is subsistence agriculture based on the herding of domesticated animals. So they're going to follow their animals, or they're going to take their animals to where there are places for them to graze. There are various approaches, and they combine some reliance on sedentary agriculture with the herding of livestock. Some pastoral nomads obtain grain from sedentary subsistence farmers. So what that means is they're going to get their grain from other farmers who don't move around. More commonly, women and children of a nomadic group tend to crops at a fixed location. And nomads may hire workers to practice sedentary agriculture. And some nomads will remain in a place and cultivate the land only when rainfall is abundant. So they might move from place to place. The nomads will move to place, and then they'll cultivate land in a time when there's rainfall. Okay, so here you see the nomads. Those are awesome little huts they have, aren't they? The great little quilting on the roofs. And they've got their donkeys. Okay, shifting cultivation is characterized by 2 distinct features. Farmers clear the land for planting by slashing vegetation and burning the debris. And then farmers grow crops on a cleared field for only a few years until the soil nutrients are depleted, then leave it fallow for many years so the soil can recover. So farmers return to a fallow site as few as 6 years later, or as many as 20 years later. So in lieu of doing kind of a crop rotation like a farmer would generally do today, they actually leave that land, go somewhere else, and then come back. Traditionally, the land is collectively owned by the village, and today, rather than in a traditional society, private individuals now own the land, and that is especially popular in Latin America. So this is where you would see that that slashing vegetation, burning the debris in order to clear the land for cultivation. Intensive subsistence farming. This feeds most of 3/4 of the world's people who live in developing countries. Farmers work intensively to subsist on a parcel of land, and most of the work is done by hand or with animals rather than machines. Virtually all available land is used for production, and parcels of land are much smaller than elsewhere in the world. And a perfect example of this is wet rice. And this is a process where rice is planted on dry land in a nursery, then moved as seedlings to a flooded field to promote growth, not gross. And this shows us our rice production in the world. And your book has a really great picture of rice production on page 363. And the map of rice production is on page 362. and a buffalo in the Philippines. There it is. That same picture's in your book. So you can see how the seedlings would be grown in a nursery, and then those seedlings are planted just like that. So they actually walk through what are called rice paddies, and they plant them one by hand. So this intensive wet rice farming is the dominant type of agriculture in the following places. So this is southeastern China, East India, and much of Southeast Asia. This type of climate prevents farmers from growing wet rice in portions. The climate prevents farmers from growing wet rice in portions of Asia, especially where summer precipitation levels are too low and winters are too harsh. So where there's just, you can see how wet it is there. In places where there's just not enough water to create those rice paddies, they're unable to grow rice like they do for subsistence farming like that, the intensive wet rice farming. So commercial agriculture in developed countries can be divided into 6 main types. And this is mixed crop and livestock farming, dairy farming, commercial gardening and fruit farming, grain farming, Mediterranean agriculture, and livestock ranching. And agribusiness is commonly used to refer to these types of farming because the family farm is not an isolated activity but is integrated into a large food production industry. So it's agribusiness because people have to be good at business in order to run a farm, a commercial farm. It's not just a farm that's going to feed your family, it's a farm that has to it has to support your family financially as well. So mixed crop and livestock farming, this is the most distinctive characteristic of the integration of crops and livestock is that most of the crops that are raised are fed to animals. So the crops that are raised on the farm, like corn or grain or wheat, are going to be fed to animals instead of humans who live there on the farm. A typical example is that it devotes nearly all land area to growing crops, but derives more than 3/4 of its income from the sale of animal products, for example, beef and eggs. This permits farmers to distribute the workload more evenly through the year because crops require less attention aside from planting and harvesting them. This typically involves the process of crop rotation, the practice of rotating the use of different fields from crop to crop each year to avoid exhausting the soil. And I can't remember if we've talked about crop rotation in here or not, or if we talked about it in my World Civ class, but that's where you have multiple fields and you move a crop. For example, let's say you have a crop that takes nitrogen out of the soil, you move that crop to the next field that takes, let's say, calcium out of the soil, and you have a fallow field, and so you're constantly rotating your crop so you're not taking the same nutrients out of your field every year, thus making it so that it's unusable. And so you're always keeping one field empty so that it can regenerate its nutrients. Okay, dairy farming is the most important type of commercial agriculture in the first ring, and we're going to talk about these rings when we get to this guy named von Thunen. And he has this really cool idea about rings of agriculture and why different types of agriculture happen at different places in a city or in the proximity to a city. So agriculture happens in the first ring outside of a city because it has to be close to the city in order to be transported, because milk goes bad. So the ring surrounding a city from which the milk is supplied is called the milk shed, and it has to be within that area because milk has an expiration date. So advances in the mode of transportation have increased the radius of the milk shed to 500 kilometers. So because milk can be refrigerated, because we have refrigeration trucks, because milk is now pasteurized, that milk shed has expanded from where prior to that, you had to get your milk within that day, and you had to, people got their milk delivered every day. So dairy farmers typically sell their milk to wholesalers who later distribute it to retailers. Retailers then sell it to consumers in shops or at home. So this tells us where milk is produced in the world. Look at how much milk is produced in India. That's fascinating. Okay, so let's look at commercial gardening and fruit farming. The predominant type of farming in this is the predominant type of farming in southeastern U.S. And is commonly referred to as truck farming. And this comes from the Middle English word truck, but not truck like we think. It comes from bartering or exchange of commodities. So people grow many of the following fruits and vegetables that consumers in developed countries demand. These are apples, asparagus, cherries, lettuce, mushrooms, and potatoes. Commercial gardening and fruit farming. Some of these fruits and vegetables are sold fresh to consumers, but most are sold to large processors for canning or freezing. And truck farms are highly efficient, large-scale operations that take full advantage of machines at all stages of the growing process. Labor costs are kept down by hiring migrant farm workers, and specialization in few crops is common. So, for example, a farm might grow just apples. A farm might grow just mushrooms. A farm might grow just oranges and grapefruit, something like that. So it's typical that they specialize. Grain farming. This is distinguished from mixed crop and livestock farming because crops are grown primarily for human consumption. Farms sell their output to manufacturers of food products such as breakfast cereals and bread. Characteristics of a typical grain farm is they're going to be heavily mechanized, as you saw from that picture of the big, I don't know my machines, that big red machine with the grain coming out of it. Farms exist in aerial extent, and they're oriented to consumer preferences. So, if people eat a lot of corn in an area, they're going to be more corn farms. So if they eat a lot of rice in one area, they're going to be rice farms. So they eat a lot of grain in one area, they're going to be grain farms. Mediterranean agriculture. Every site practicing this form of agriculture borders a sea, which makes sense. And most are on west coasts of continents. So the prevailing sea winds provide moisture and moderate the winter temperatures. Farmers derive a smaller percentage of income from animal products. Most crops are grown for human consumption. Horticulture, which is the growing of fruits, vegetables, and flowers, and tree crops, form the commercial base. And along the Mediterranean Sea, olives and grapes are the two most important cash crops. And I think if you picture in your head the Mediterranean, hopefully you can envision olives, olive oil, grapes for wine. Approximately half of the land here is used to grow cereals. Oh, it's so beautiful. Let's take a trip. Don't you wish you went with Miss Adair last summer? I do. Agriculture in developed regions, livestock ranching. Ranching is the commercial grazing of livestock over an extensive area. This is well suited for semi-arid or arid land. It's practiced in developed countries where vegetation is too sparse and soil too poor to support crops. Historically, ranchers sought to move their cattle from Texas to Chicago because the cattle were worth more money farther north. Today, ranching has become part of the meat processing industry, where new methods of breeding and sources of water and feed are embraced. There's some ranchers. Have you guys all seen the movie City Slickers? It's really good. These guys have midlife crises, and they have to go they don't have to, but they decide to go on a cattle roundup and take these cows across the country. It's pretty good. You should see it. There's adventures, of course. Okay, so they're going to go from Texas. I mean, in this show, in the movie they don't, but they're going to go from Texas to Chicago. And think about what is Chicago known for industry-wise. If you don't know yet, that's okay. we're going to get to industry. So we've got meat production. And look at, do you know what well, you know now, Argentina is known for cattle. Look at all the cattle out west. And isn't this fascinating, given that before the Columbian Exchange, there were no cows at all in the Americas? And look at all the cows. Cool stuff, huh? Okay, sorry about that. Get kind of crazy with the Columbian Exchange. So, challenges for farmers in developing countries. Subsistence farmers must feed an increasing number of people because of rapid population growth in developing countries. Food supply is increased through intensification of production via new farming methods and leaving land fallow for shorter periods of time. So here's some folks doing their subsistence farming. So this is terrace farming. See the steps they have here? Subsistence farmers must grow food for export instead of for direct consumption due to the adoption of the international trade approach to development. So this is something really interesting, that in a lot of countries, for example, Kenya, places are having to use their land to grow food for export rather than feeding their own people. So Kenya has amazing farmland, but they are using that land to grow coffee to export to places like the United States so we can drink their yummy coffee, rather than growing food there to feed the Kenyan people, because they're paying off their national debt with that coffee. So consumers in developed countries are willing to pay high prices for fruits and vegetables that would otherwise be out of season locally. So they're paying high prices to eat food that they could be growing locally. They could be growing other food locally, but they're paying off their debts by selling coffee in their country to other countries. Overproduction in commercial farming. Commercial farmers suffer from low incomes because they're capable of producing more food than is demanded by consumers in developed countries. When demand is stagnant in developed countries because of low population growth. So commercial farmers have to actually lower their prices because demand is not as high. And so when demand is low, you have to lower your price for something. If you guys are in econ, you can explain that to everybody. And then the U.S. government has formed policies that attempt to address excess production. So farmers are encouraged to avoid producing crops that are in excess supply, and the government actually pays farms when certain commodity prices are low. The government buys surplus production and sells or donates it to foreign governments. The importance of access to markets. Geographers use the von Thunen model, and we'll talk more about that, to help explain the importance of proximity to market and the choice of crops on commercial farms. So here are those rings we were talking about. The first ring are the highly perishable foods like milk. The second ring are the items that are more difficult to transport, like wood, so difficult like heavy or just cumbersome. The third ring are various crops and pasture lands, and the fourth ring are spacious lands for animal grazing. And I think there's a picture, but if not, we will talk about this ad nauseum. Von Thunen's model can be scaled up for national and global markets. So what are the strategies to increase the world's food supply? So there are 4 strategies being employed to distribute food to everyone in the world. These are increasing exports from countries with surpluses. We know that lots of countries, including the United States, have tons and tons of food. Expanding the land area used for agriculture. So there are lots of countries that have land, they're just not using that land for agriculture. Expanding fishing, increasing the productivity of land now used for agriculture. And so there's land that is being farmed, it's just not being farmed to its highest extent. So countries with surpluses. Actually, guys, we're about at 30 minutes, so let's stop here and we'll talk more maybe tomorrow.